So speaking from a wealth of experience, please welcome Emma Boulton to the stage.
Hi, everyone. That really made me nervous, listening to that. Like, how do you get on stage when someone calls you a thought leader? And also, I can't take credit for all the work that the research operations community do, all of the thought that went into the 8 pillars. That was all collaborative. That wasn't just me. I was the author, but yeah, I just want to give a shout out to all of the other people that were there at the start of that community and continue to support it today. But I'm very honored to be here. I was hoping to be here 2 years ago, but unfortunately, my dad passed away, so I couldn't be here. So I'm really glad that I've been able to come here today and join you all. So that title there, let's go back actually. Meeting product where they are. I was trying to be a bit provocative because I thought that might entice people. And I just want to talk about a couple of scenarios now that you might be familiar with. So, have you ever come across any versions of these in your work? We want to see highly strategic, long-range generative research with high impact. But we don't have time to do proper discovery. I have to look at the screen, sorry about this. We want a vision and a strategy. But you've only got 2 weeks. Okay? We want to focus on solving customer problems. But actually, we just want you to build this feature that we thought of first. We want a frictionless experience. But we don't have time to fix any of the usability issues. And then, my personal favorite, we want to be customer obsessed. All businesses want to be customer obsessed, don't they? But then they're going to lay off half of us. This is what happened to me. But I'm not bitter about that. It's fine. I've moved on from that now. So these were all variations of these. Product teams want what we can offer, our depth, our breadth, and rigor, but they want it now. So how can we meet product where they are? So I was pondering this question as I was preparing for this talk, and I was reading lots of articles and listening to podcasts and watching other talks, and I revisited a talk that I gave in 2015, where I highlighted this article. And it was written more than 10 years ago now by Lou Rosenfeld and published on A List Apart. And in this article, Lou talks about the problems that he had seen in Silicon Valley, where he was walking down these corridors and kind of talking to these executives, and he found that there was loads of data, but the problem that he saw was that this data wasn't being used and that their products still universally sucked, basically. So he talked about that in this article. And then, at the same time, Aaron Walter published this article on A List Apart. And he talked about the challenge of connecting the dots between insights and how they had loads of insights. He was working at MailChimp at the time, and how they couldn't connect the dot between these different insights. So they came up with this idea of like a research repository, and they used this workaround in Evernote. And I think that was the first time that I'd ever kind of heard about this idea of a research repository, aside from a research library. Now, of course, we've got all kinds of tools that we use to do this. But I think what's interesting about these 2 articles is that we are still struggling with these same problems. We're drowning in research and data, but we just don't know what it's telling us. There's just too much info. Death by PowerPoint, Slack channels overload, research graveyards. We're just repeating the same studies needlessly. We know research exists, but we don't know where to find it. And so on and so on. We're still struggling with these problems in our organizations. And these are all knowledge problems. We have a knowledge problem. Actually, we have a knowledge management problem. Product teams are just drowning in information that's poorly managed. So often when you talk about knowledge management, people immediately suggest using a research repository or getting a new tool. That's just what I just did, wasn't it? I just showed you a slide about that. But this isn't the solution. And I'm not going to tell you today to do that. And I think this quote from Emily DeLeo sums up the one takeaway you should remember from this talk. So Emily is an expert in knowledge management, and if you haven't come across any of her work, I urge you to go and look her up on LinkedIn or on Medium, or in fact, she's published things on the Research Ops community website, and just read what she has to say, because she's extremely knowledgeable about this. But she says the repository isn't the key to elevating UX research. Knowledge management is. So that is probably the one takeaway from this talk. All right, so we need a knowledge management strategy, but how do we create that? And there's been quite a few kind of C models used this last couple of days, but I've got another one for you. And this is the 3 Cs. We need to focus on these 3 areas when we think about knowledge. First, connection, second, consumption, and then third, control. And they come together in a model. And the first of connection is all about kind of bringing that knowledge together, assimilating it, synthesizing and organizing it. The second is about consumption, and that's about transfer of knowledge through sort of sharing and broadcasting and communication. And finally, control. And that's all about managing knowledge through curation and data management. So I'm going to talk to you now about these 3 areas. All right, so let's get started. This first area is connection. Right, so these were some problems that I started to talk about at the start. And these are fairly common things that we see across a lot of teams, that we're working in silos, and we're drowning in a lot of research and data, but we don't really know what it's telling us. So why is this? Well, I think these problems exist because of the way we work today. So I'm not talking about working remotely. Sorry about keep hitting my microphone. I'm not talking about working remotely versus coming into the office, but that probably doesn't help. I think this is because we're often embedded in autonomous teams, thinking about really narrow problems. So it's really interesting what Indy was just talking about there, because we are often really focused on these tiny little problems and not kind of thinking big. We can literally be working on the same thing as a partner team and have no idea. And we're not collaborating across these divides because it's easier to just keep moving forwards, moving quickly. Or if we're in an agency or we're acting as an internal one, we're working as a service to clients or internal teams. And this all boils down to one thing. We can't see that big picture. Things aren't connected. So how can we fix this? So we need to bridge the gap. And the first step is just to bring together people. Bring together your research and data teams. Or if you're an individual contributor, get to know your colleagues in data science and analytics. And over time, you might find these things start to evolve into more of a community of practice. But the key focus should just be about how you might grow as a researcher, or as an insight professional, or a user experience professional, by learning from each other. And here are some things you can do to facilitate cross-functional collaboration. Implement a program where you maybe go and spend time working in different departments to promote understanding and empathy. Integrated teams. I think you can also bring together cross-functional teams to work on specific projects, encourage regular check-ins and keep everyone aligned. And really promote that learning mindset through open dialogue, create channels or forums where employees can ask, hey, do you have any data on this? Has anyone done any work on this? And you can discuss ideas without judgment. And also just think about failure as learning. I think a couple of people touched on this yesterday. Celebrate case studies. Talk about that. and learn from those areas and help to foster that kind of growth mindset and sharing culture. We've just started doing something similar, actually, in my current workplace, and already we're seeing the benefit of bringing people together. So once you've started to just come together, you can start to share what you're working on. And like I said, you can ask, have you done any work on this? Does anyone know why our customers are doing why? At my previous employer, Meta, many teams do understand road mapping alongside regular road mapping. And this was something that I really liked. It was a roadmap of prioritized questions that would be answered in that quarter and kind of prioritized to be the most impactful questions that we were grappling with. And then it was also kind of a roadmap of who would answer the questions and enable different functions to come together to think about those problems. So as I said, it enabled lots of teams who worked in data, insights, research to come together and kind of align and coordinate their efforts. It also enabled us to think about mixed methods and how to bring together qual, quant, different kinds of studies, and also triangulate that data so that we could increase confidence, build different hypotheses, and then kind of give a richer picture. So I'd highly recommend having a think about pulling that into your teams. So just going back a step, I think someone asked a really great question this morning about what if you're not a kind of data literate person. And I think this is my answer to that question. That I think it was for Giles, that we sometimes forget that our role is not just to carry out the research or collect data and publish findings. We're actually synthesizers. We're synthesis specialists as researchers, and this is where we can bring these skills. I love this quote. I saw this last week on LinkedIn. I'll just read it out. I don't know if you can see it. Systems-minded humans with a compulsion to connect the dots. You are not a generalist. You are a specialist of synthesis, a master of complexity, a weaver of wholeness, an O-type. I thought this was great. This is me to an O, not a T. So we need to use those core skills, as I said. And those core skills are foresight, the ability to see the bigger picture, the desire to learn more and constantly seek new knowledge. Use your analytical abilities to evaluate data from multiple perspectives and search for patterns. And the key one here for me is our synthesis skills, the act of combining different ideas or things to make a whole that is new and different. That's crucial. In this new world of AI, as we've been talking about, reduced headcount and information overload, that's where we add value as researchers. Reframing, as Indy talked about, framing knowledge into a coherent narrative that helps people make better decisions. So, to summarize this section, we've learned that we can solve the problems that I highlighted at the start of this section by focusing on collaboration, coordination, and connecting the dots. But what are the benefits if you do that? Well, breaking out of current silos, bridging the gap between functions, having a better understanding of our colleagues' skills, learning new skills and methods from each other, and I think creating and working towards a shared purpose, as well as building rigor and hypotheses, sense-checking results, and filling the gaps between methods. All right, let's move on. So we're going to now talk about consumption or transferring knowledge. So these are the next set of problems that I think are fairly common in product teams, and I talked about a couple of those at the start. So there's just too much information. We know that research exists, but we don't always know where to find it. We're repeating the same studies needlessly. How might we solve these? Okay, so at the start of the talk, I said that repositories aren't a magic bullet. Now comes the part where I say they can be helpful. I'm going to contradict myself. So Emily, who I also quoted, talks about the principles of knowledge management, and she said the first principle of knowledge management is a single point of access. research library. Research studies typically involve a lot of assets, as you know, and they often live across like multiple tools, and that creates a really onerous search process. By making a front door, that will make your assets discoverable and findable. So a single point of access can live anywhere in a shared folder, a project management tool, or even a research report. Whatever you use, it needs to be a location that everyone has access to on the team, and it must support file sharing and links. So it doesn't have to be a tool. It could be Google Doc, for example, or a wiki. So Emily's second principle of knowledge management is description for access. So she advocates for shared standards for describing research, and we commonly use a taxonomy to do this. Before you jump in and create one, though, you should start by asking yourself whether you actually need one. And these are some questions that the research ops community have published that you can ask yourself as to whether you need to create one. So I'll read those out. Research insights cannot be found by co-workers who need them when they need them. Research is repeated unnecessarily because the team could not find the prior work. Frequent requests received for information from previous research. So these indicate whether you need a taxonomy or not, and they do sound a lot like the problems I shared earlier, don't they? All right, so the final kind of area here in consumption is around communicate. And of course, this is our bread and butter as researchers. This is a core skill as a designer or as a researcher. We need to ensure that research is well communicated and consumed by the right people at the right time. So we can do this by fostering a culture of knowledge sharing. Storytelling is obviously a fundamental skill for researchers. If it's done badly, it can mean our stakeholders are less likely to act upon our insights. You can use models or frameworks, thinking styles, and maps to help. By anchoring your story on that single framework, model, or map, you can help your audience to understand how sections relate to one another and tie the whole thing together. I think this is what Indy was talking about a little bit in one of the questions that was posed to her, where you can kind of show in that big picture how that matters in terms of the solution space. So they can be used across the business to form a united customer narrative. So some other things to think about here are broadcast summaries, so a roundup of all the sort of insights that, or data that has been produced in that last month or quarter. And you can kind of give that a collective brand to help drive visibility and increase reach. And then you can also encourage further communication by setting up recurring events, lunch and learns and those kinds of things. But what are the benefits of thinking about how people consume knowledge? Well, better storytelling, cutting through that noise that we talked about, having a common language, helping to connect teams together because they're talking about the same thing and creating alignment, having a joined-up view of problems, and also not duplicating work and reducing effort. And obviously, last but not least, easier to find insights. So finally, we're on our final C, control. And this is what I think people think about when you talk about knowledge management. We've got another set of problems here that we need to think about, and that is research being used out of context, data being retained for too long or used for the wrong purposes, and not easily being able to track the impact of our work. So how might we solve these? Okay, governance. This is the dry bit. Knowledge management is obviously heavily intertwined with research governance. Governance of research is really important, and I hopefully don't need to bang on too much about that to all you all, but it's something that we need to think about long after the research is done. So there are lots of platforms available for researchers to gather, store, synthesize, and reuse their research. If you do use any of those, you do need to think about governance before you go ahead, during the rollout of that platform, and then on an ongoing basis as you check individuals are following the right processes. And obviously, alongside managing knowledge, there's a lot of data management to do. So some of our data requires special care as it's personal or sensitive data, such as, working in health. It's super important. And it's really important that you have these defined processes for tracking, retention, and deleting this kind of data. It's not just that personal data, though. It's those insights that you've de-identified and maybe just sitting in your research library or repository. You need to consider the shelf life of these. How many months or years do insights stay relevant? Are some more evergreen than others? You need to think about that and tend that data as well. So that brings me on to reusing insights. So this is Joe Munko, who was previously a director of research at Microsoft, and I think he sums it up well here in this quote. Timeless research is really about building long-term organizational knowledge and curating what you've already learned. Disposable research is the stuff you throw away after you ship. To be truly lean, get rid of that wasteful process. Instead, focus your research team's time on making connections between past insights, then reusing and remixing them in new contexts. So I think this is really interesting. This is called different things in different places, but you may do this at the start of a project, and you may call it a knowledge harvest, or a literature review, or just a resynthesis. It's good to start with what we already know, because often we know a lot. And that brings me finally on to tracking impact. If you think back to all the problems and the things that we're kind of grappling with as researchers as a result of the multiple asks from product teams, thinking about our impact can help. Now, we had a few talks about this yesterday. I think, in particular, we can think about how to keep a record of our impact. And I love this from Lizzie Burnham, who wrote this for user interviews. Actually tracking impact in your research repository so that you kind of track that back to the actual insight and the decision that was made as a result of it. And it can really help demonstrate the business value of research and insights. So the benefits of thinking about managing knowledge are obviously efficiency, reduction of repetition, and more awareness of impact on decisions, and being proactive rather than reactive. So, to recap, I'm at the end now. We did a whistle-stop tour of the kind of key areas to think about when it comes to knowledge management. But remember, it's just not a linear journey, and it's not something that's ever done. You need to keep going through these cycles. It requires us to be proactive about maintenance and management. What can you take away from this? So we need to focus on these three key areas when it comes to knowledge management. First, connection, all about bringing people and knowledge together, assimilating and organizing it. Second of all, consumption, thinking about how we transfer knowledge through sharing and broadcasting. And then thirdly, control, about the management of knowledge through access control and data management. Finally, I just want to finish by circling back to remind you where we started. I don't know about you, but those things that I shared that we were all laughing about at the start, but sometimes meeting product where we are is exhausting. I don't know about you, but I feel like it's an exhausting time as well to be in the industry. We've heard a lot of people talking about the state of UX. We're already overloaded, and we've taken on even more tasks. We've pivoted from in-person research to remote research. We've had to onboard new tools, new processes, and new people, all whilst working remotely with the fear of illness. We've gone through the great resignation, reorgs, layoffs, and now we find ourselves at the UX research reckoning. Wow. I mean, I know this was referenced yesterday. I read this when Judd Antin published this, and I was kind of like, wow. Okay, I might just go and hang up my hat. And you may have been tempted to do the same. I do think we have to change. We can't continue to work like we have been doing, not just scaling the teams, but scaling the research, producing more and more and more research. It has to stop. We have to change. We can't keep being hamsters in a wheel. We have to work more efficiently, prioritize the most important questions, join together the dots with other data, tell a really compelling story, and reuse those insights. In this new world of constraint, I believe that knowledge management is one of the most important pillars of research operations. By focusing on it, we can help, support, and enable researchers, and even our research leaders, to do their best work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. Any questions? I found that very insightful. I think we all struggle with knowledge management and making the time for knowledge management, right? That's usually the thing. We're often so caught up in the busyness of executing and informing everyone that we forget to manage everything we already know. Any questions? I see a lot of hands going up on this side. I think in the back they were faster, sorry. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My name is Angelica. My question is about attention span. Some statistics say that we have less and less attention span from generation to generation. Do you perceive that that barrier exists? And how do you motivate people to read reports and learn from them? Well, with a limited mental capacity, let's say that. Thanks.
So I'm hard of hearing. I've got hearing aids.
Let me recap.
I didn't quite hear that, so I'm going to ask Miriam to translate for me.
So I think the question was, how does the fact that our attention span is decreasing and decreasing, how might that impact knowledge management?
That's a really good question. Sorry, I struggle to hear sometimes. Yeah, I think that's a great one. And I think that's right. It's really important that we keep joining the dots between different sources of data. I don't know about you, but in my organization, there's so much information churned out. And I think it's often in the way we share it as well. So, one of the things that I'm always talking to my team about are kind of what are the most important things that we need to focus on, not everything. Maybe kind of put that later in, in an appendix even. Or I know we know all of this stuff, but we don't always need to communicate everything at all times. So it's like really thinking about those kind of principles of, broadcasting the same way you would if you were kind of writing a post on LinkedIn or, back in the days when you could only write 140 characters in a tweet. Like, what do you need to tell people and kind of thinking about that? So I think hopefully that answers your question. It's around joining together the dots between other sources of data, trying to build that story, but also thinking about what are the most important things that I also need to say about my research.
Thank you. So kind of working with that attention span and catering to it in a way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I'm going to take one more question from the screen, and then we're going to wrap up the Q&A. But I think it's relevant. So how do you feel right now about AI chatbots that are specifically trained to curate those knowledge management systems?
Yeah, this is a good one. We've had this come up at work already. Can we just replace kind of what you do with this tool? And I think we've been trialing some of the AI software within. We use Dovetail, and they've got some of these tools within that. And I think it's okay. We shouldn't be scared to try these tools out. But I think someone said it yesterday. See them as a partner to researcher, and maybe just time saving. It's like a first pass of synthesis. But that's where we add value, is interpretation of that. That's what AI chatbots can't do. They can't kind of go into the nuance that Indy was talking about and think about the context of that insight. So I think it's fine. It saves time, but I think we do need that sort of curation and communication of that. And that's where humans add so much value, in my mind.
Thank you for answering that, Emma. And thanks so much for being with us here today. I was delighted to be on stage with a thought leader. I think you lived up to that label that I gave you in the beginning. Let's give a warm thank you to Emma as she leaves the stage.